Hello, reader. I'm Alix.
I'm Kelly.
And this is
the Lit Joy Podcast.
Chelsea Abdullah is an award-winning author of the Sandsea Trilogy, an epic fantasy series that begins with the Stardust Thief. An American-Kuwaiti writer born and raised in Kuwait, she grew up listening to stories about mysterious desert creatures and wily, only sometimes likable, heroes. Consumed by wanderlust, she put down her roots in various states. After earning her MA in English, she moved to the East Coast, where she currently lives. When not immersed in her own fictional worlds, she spends her free time playing video games, doodling characters, and hoarding books she doesn't have shelf space for. Chelsea, welcome. Welcome to the Lit Joy Podcast. It is so lovely to have you.
Hello. Thank you both for having me.
I always love talking with the authors and getting all the backstory. Anyone who knows my book preferences know that I love backstory of all kinds. So this is my favorite when we get to interview authors, hear more about the process, talk through your inspiration, writing, all of that. So should we just dive right in? Because I want to hear about it.
Well, the first things first, I want to know, okay, so listeners know The Stardust Thief is book one of your Sandsea Trilogy. And the second book, can you tell us when it's coming out? Can you tell us more details about this book?
Yeah. So The Ashfire King will be out in 2025. Right now, summer 2025 is kind of the filler date that we have. I'm hoping sometime within the next month, actually, to release that date. So fingers crossed. I am also holding my breath.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, so The Ashfire King is a direct sequel. It takes place pretty much immediately after the first book, follows the characters on a different journey. The stakes are somehow even higher than they are in the first book. Trying to avoid spoilers here. But the second book kind of takes a more branching perspective, sort of similar to how, you have the two worlds on the two-faced coin, which is this magic that's featured in book one. Book two kind of has two sides to the story. And so, with one group of characters, you're following sort of two groups. I don't want to specify who's in which group. But you're following two different groups, in two different locations across the map. There's, I think, 6 new locations in this book. So the world expands a lot more. And the story kind of comes together through, both of those groups on their journeys. So the Ashfire King really expands the story, expands the world. There's a lot more magic, which is really exciting. A lot more setting-based magic, so a lot more magical locations, which, has been fun to write. I hope it's just as fun to read. Definitely a lot more expansion, higher stakes. I don't want to quite get into the plot or the conflict, just because I don't, I want to avoid spoilers. But I'm very excited to share more about it.
Amazing. I'm excited.
Sounds so magical, literally.
Yes, literally.
Literally.
That's the hope.
That's amazing. Well, I want to know, this is kind of a question we always ask our authors when they come on, because it is so interesting to hear. These questions kind of feel like take your kid to work day, where you're like, what do you do at work? But it's so different for each author. Yeah. And so I am curious to know a little bit about your backstory of getting into writing, and then we'll go into your writing process. So what inspired you to become a writer? And kind of as an extension of that, when did you really identify yourself as a writer?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I feel like, as with many people, many authors, I've always loved to write. I grew up keeping journals filled with short stories that were handwritten. A lot of these stories were in true kid fashion, very wacky.
Yeah.
I think I would sort of, as a kid, I would write fan fiction almost of like the things that I loved, like, oh, I play with, these kinds of dolls. I'm going to write a story where they come to life, and this is going to be the story on the page. So I've been writing for a very long time. I don't really think I had considered writing as a profession or writing seriously until, I want to say, so it was past my undergrad. I wrote kind of as a hobby. I really enjoyed writing. I had friends who wrote. We would trade off stories. I would, on occasion be a part of writing workshops, but I never really thought to myself, this is my goal for when I want to get published. I didn't even know anything about querying, about being agented, none of that. I was just kind of going with the flow, which I think is my personality. And what happened was during my undergrad degree, so that was the first time I had been out of Kuwait for an extended period of time. So I was born and raised in Kuwait. And had, of course, visited the US, and I have family in the US. So I went back and forth. But I did my undergrad degree at CU Boulder in Colorado. And so that was the longest stretch of time that I had been away from home. And I felt very homesick. And so, I was thinking to myself, is there any way that I can bring the stories that I grew up with, the culture that I grew up with, and sort of mesh them together into this story that will be kind of like a sanctuary for me, as a writer, but also just as a person. I really missed Kuwait, and I, really missed my friends, my family. So it's, what is the Stardust Thief started off as a very personal project. I didn't have any goals of publishing it. Before then, I had written many, many long manuscripts entirely for fun. One thing that I always tell people is that I am an extreme overwriter. So, the Stardust Thief, when it was published, was 144,000 words, which I think averaged out to about 450 pages. My older drafts would get up to 450,000 words.
Oh my gosh.
The long
There's so much backstory in there and detail.
It was, yeah, no, it was, they were not book shaped, suffice it to say.
Perfect.
This is what I mean about having fun, I was really seeing these characters through an entire journey. The longest thing that I had ever written, and I will never look at this book ever again, was 770,000 words.
All right.
Okay. So again, I wrote my way through that entire manuscript, just having fun. One of the reasons I write is because I am invested and I'm intrigued by what's on the page. That's also why I'm a pantser, and I figure it out as I go along. So not knowing what's going to happen, and, usually I have an idea of the ending, an idea of certain plot points, but sort of figuring out those pieces in between and seeing the characters grow is actually what makes me super excited as a writer. It's the reason I write. So those older stories, that's basically what I was doing. I was writing these really, really long first drafts. They were very bad. Definitely should not see the light of day. And then I wrote The Stardust Thief. I wrote it for National Novel Writing Month. I very luckily had sort of a beta reader, or someone who was reading while I was writing. I was reading her chapters at the same time. Neither of us were critiquing each other. We were just kind of readers for each other, being there, psyching each other up and saying, oh, this is so exciting. I can't wait to read the next chapter. So, I'm always extremely grateful to this person, because I don't think I would have finished The Stardust Thief had she not been rooting for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I finished this book. The first draft was 297,000 words. So it was long again. But it was the first time I had ever finished something and thought to myself, this feels like something I could make into a book. It feels like the story is there. It feels like I can cut it down and make it into a novel. And that was the first time I'd ever felt that way about my writing. I think I wrote 5 really long drafts before this. And each and every single time I just thought, oh, I'm doing this for the fun of it. And then, I got to the end of The Stardust Thief and thought, what if I try to edit this and see what happens? So I finished The Stardust Thief after my undergrad. I was doing a master's program at Pittsburgh. I just finished a master's program in Pittsburgh. So it was, sort of after all of that education, and I set myself to editing. And I edited for, I think it was 3 years or something like that. I kind of took my time, really eased myself into it. And then, the rest from there is kind of history. I got an agent after that. I feel very lucky because querying is an extremely difficult process. A lot of it relies on luck. I feel like, the Stardust Thief happened to be the right book for the right person at the right time. And so, the querying journey for me was not as long as I know some other people have been in the trenches for, and I'm exceptionally grateful for that. But yeah, and then we sent the book on to editors, and now here I am at Orbit.
Very cool.
Yeah, no, so it's been a really remarkable journey. Some people talk about wishing they could have done this when they were younger. I always say I never want to have any of those old drafts published. But I'm also firmly of the belief that every single thing you do as a writer, regardless of whether you're trying to get something published, is one step closer to where you eventually will need to be. So I don't regret how long it's taken me. And, comparatively to many other authors, I joined publishing relatively early as well. So, it's all a matter of perspective. But yeah, so I came into this from a place of love. And I'm really glad that I did. I was never really chasing trends or trying to hurry myself. And I'm glad that I took the time that I did.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I feel like I've bumped in just in our job and kind of the different communities that we interact with. I've bumped into people who are trying to write to a trend that the publisher kind of sets like expectation, and your whole process just sounds very organic to you and very authentic to your, just like true self and how you write. So that's really beautiful. And also we get a lot of authors on here who talk about just like the struggle. And it sounds like you really saw it all through the lens of being like an experience as opposed to a struggle. So that's really beautiful.
Like enjoying the journey.
Yes.
Yeah. And, I always think to myself, like, I think this in retrospect, right? Like it's very easy to look back at something and say, oh, but it was all so nice. And, I struggled, but it was worth it. But I am certain that I had those moments of strife. And, I'm definitely feeling a different kind of stress moving into the sequels and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But yeah, in general, I definitely try to take a more positive, optimistic approach. And I think it's kept me sane. This can be a very difficult industry. But trying to remain as rooted as you possibly can, in your own love for the writing, I think definitely helps.
That's amazing.
So maybe for listeners, we could get a quick elevator pitch of The Stardust Thief, so they can get even more excited to read that and then The Ashfire King.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so The Stardust Thief is the first book in the Sandsea Trilogy. It's an adventure story. It follows a merchant, a prince, a djinn, and a thief on their quest to find a magical lamp. As these characters are traveling through the desert, they will unearth terrible secrets, dangerous magics, and of course, along the way, there's a whole lot of banter and shenanigans because this is an adventure quest. The book, sort of focuses on 4 characters, very much a ragtag team story, lots of found family and, magics, djinn, all of that kind of lore. So yeah, I like to think that it's a very magical, exciting quest. And, book 2 is a little bit more of that, a very unique, different kind of journey. But definitely picks up exactly where book 1 left off. So, hopefully going into book 2, more people will pick up The Stardust Thief.
Okay. And is this going to be a trilogy?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Oh, more. Yes, more books. Oh gosh, thank you so much. Having read it, I was like, perfect. That's a great synopsis to keep spoilers out of it, but to like sprinkle in all the good, like what you can discover when you read this book. It's very magical. It's very different from a lot of books I've read in the fantasy space. And I love that. And so the culture that you brought to it, as you mentioned, like feeling a little bit homesick, wanting to write of, Kuwait and those characters. I am a little more curious if you felt like you had characters, like when you were writing your characters, if there were people in mind for any of them, which I'm sure some of them know, but like how much you brought in from real life versus just like inspiration from Kuwait. But yeah, I just was wondering a little bit more on the backstory of like how much you pulled in from your life or your experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Stardust Thief, as I was saying earlier, when I had first started conceptualizing this story or conceptualizing the idea of this story, I was thinking to myself that I would love to do something based on the stories that I grew up with in Kuwait. So, growing up, my dad, my grandfather, actually both sides of my family, I have a lot of storytellers. But for the Stardust Thief in particular, I was thinking about the stories that I heard from my dad. So, these were stories, these were sort of like little like folk tales and stuff from around the country, of course. But a lot of those tales were versions of the 1001 Nights. So, he would sit down, me and my sister at night, and that was sort of like our bedtime story. I definitely remember those stories a lot more than she does. But we both experienced them, and they really stuck with me. It was one of those things, distance makes the heart grow fonder. I grew up with all these stories. I thought, yeah, great. They're cool. They're magical. And then, when I traveled to Colorado, I thought, I was like filled with nostalgia and all of that. And that was one of the first things that I thought of. So I'd say when I started with the Stardust Thief, I sort of had this core idea of doing something that was maybe inspired by the 1001 Nights. The story of the 40 thieves, Alibaba and the 40 thieves, definitely always comes to mind because I remember as a kid being like, I don't know if I like the way women are treated in this story. Like, I remember making those comments as a child.
Yes.
And if you look at the thieves in my book, one of the main characters is actually a thief. She is one of the 40 thieves. And she is one of the most badass characters on that crew. So clearly I had a lot of opinions and I brought it to this story after many years. But yeah, so, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about, Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp. And there are a couple of other stories. I think there's a version, or there's some details in there inspired by The Sleeper and The Waker, something like that. It has different translations. And then there are a bunch of other little cultural tidbits. So in general, I think when I was thinking about, drawing from Kuwaiti culture, it was the things like the food, the attire, also just the lifestyle, the way that people would interact, the sort of respect that you have in the culture for certain groups of people, for, just the different social cues. So I was just sort of thinking about lifestyle generally. And, obviously this is a fantasy book, and it's inspired, it is in its own world. But, it takes place in the past. So in addition to thinking about, the sorts of things that I had grown up with, I was also thinking about, history and tradition and all of that. And so trying to bring that into the story. What is it, what does heritage look like to me? And how did I perceive these stories growing up? And how could I translate that into a fantasy project that meant something to me? So a lot of the details are smaller details like that. I don't think any of the characters were directly inspired by people. I definitely think they would be able to tell if they were. I do like to say that, I think every character that an author writes is in some way themselves, in a weird way. I think even if you're writing, say, like a villain, you are writing it through the lens of your own mind. And so you're thinking, oh, this is a terrible thing because I think it's a terrible thing. This is something I would never do, or this is something I would consider as villainous. So I think in every way, like every character has sort of a little slice of mentality maybe from me. And then when I think about my main cast, there are definitely certain parts of their personality that resonate with me. Luli, who is she's the midnight merchant. She travels, she finds these ancient relics, these magics. She's sort of filled with wanderlust. And I've felt that my whole life. I think coming from Kuwait, and, I was very lucky to be able to travel to so many locations as a kid. And, just having that privilege. And I think being torn between two places, having family in America growing up, but then also living in Kuwait, with, another side of my family, it always sort of felt like I was in this in-between space, which I think is, I don't want it to sound unfortunate, because I think, for me, like having that nuance in my identity is, one of the things that I'm very grateful for. I'm glad that I was exposed to so many different cultures and was able to visit so many places growing up. But I think a lot of that has made it into Luli. Mazen is, Mazen has my love for storytelling, in probably the purest sense. So Mazen is this book's prince. He's trying his best. He's a bit of a coward prince. His true love is for storytelling. So, his brother is the leader of this band of thieves. His father is kind of a violent sultan. But he sort of has a heart of gold amidst all of this. And that is his strength as a character, is that he's able to remain empathetic, despite all of the hardships and the people that he's surrounded by. So, Mazen's dedication to storytelling and, his sort of like starry-eyed vision of what stories mean, or what they can mean, is something that I think I feel a lot as someone who appreciates the power of storytelling. So in that way, Mazen is, I think, the truest mouthpiece that I could have for something like that. And then, I mean, Aisha's a very stabby, no nonsense thief. So I would say she's probably she's the least like me. But I sometimes feel like I would really like to have more of that, that straightforward sort of dedication that she has. It also makes her a joy to write. She's just sort of, some would argue single-minded.
Yeah.
But she's very dedicated to her cause, and kind of like lets nothing get in her way, which I think is very admirable under certain circumstances. So yeah, of my main cast, I think all of them sort of have like a different piece of me in them.
Oh, and I'm like, I think that is, you can only write what you're able to kind of analyze. And one of our Lunicorns is our love group. And we did have one Lunicorn that asked a question for you, where it's Brenna F. She did ask what methods or techniques you use to help ensure your characters feel more real. And so you kind of mentioned bringing in parts of yourself as you create this character. But do you have any actual like techniques or like worksheets or things you do to like infuse them with more of that, just make them feel like more real people, if that makes sense, and more dimensional?
Yeah, that is a really great question. So because I'm a pantser, which means I am really flying by the seat of my pants while I'm working on my books, with, some sort of like goalposts, like here's where I want to go and here's what the ending is. A lot of the character development happens very naturally on the page for me. And of course, when I say naturally, I mean across many drafts and many edits. One of the things that I tell people is in my early drafts, especially the early draft of the Stardust Thief, it kind of read like a soap opera. Like everyone was very dramatic and over the top for no good reason. Yeah. And I feel like for me, that's actually how I work. So my characters tend to express everything very loudly in the first drafts. And then over time, I slowly but surely like tone them down. Like, no, we don't need to be yelling about this particular thing. We can be normal about this. So, because I don't have a lot of sheets or, don't do a lot of planning, most of what happens for me is I'll just kind of explore things on the page. Another thing for me that works really well for characters is having some kind of dynamic on the page, which is usually why, and I've gone into every single story And I've said, this is going to be a one POV story. This is 3 POVs now. This
Yeah.
So, every single book, I think I've come into it thinking, this is the main character. But I'm a very restless writer. And so I like to get into other people's heads. And I like to see a character looking at another character through their own eyes. So like for me, one of the most magical moments is when I have 2 main characters meet on the page and I get to see from their perspective what they think of one another.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it is like, a trial situation. Like I said, everything is a little bit more in the first draft. But having those characters banter, having them talk to each other on the page is really helpful for when I'm trying to figure out their personalities. So for me, a lot of what I figure out about my characters is almost very external because I'm discovering it on the page. I'm discovering things about them as they're talking to other characters. And then because my drafts are so long, I can afford to cut down a lot of words when I'm editing. So, and other writers have said this before, but the first draft is you just telling yourself the story. And I feel that very strongly. And so I feel that way with my characters as well. The first draft is a way for me to get to know them. Even if they are talking for 17 pages, it's way too long. Ultimately at the end of the day, that's going to be snapped down into like 2 pages in the final book. I will know so much more about them as the writer, having discovered them through that conversation. I know that doesn't necessarily work for everyone. I know most people want to avoid writing that many words, which I agree. If you can avoid writing that many words, I highly recommend it. It is a lot to be an overwriter. But yeah, all that being said, I think my advice would be to just let the characters play and exist on the page. To not really worry about how they're coming off in the first draft. When I first wrote The Stardust Thief, I had this very vague idea in my mind of Mazen being this flirty prince. I was like, oh, he's totally like this lady killer. He's going to, sweep women off their feet. And then I got to him on the page and this man didn't even know how to talk to, Louis, who was the main character. I said, he is not in fact anything like I thought he would be. And, he turned into a completely different character, which, for the better, I think, because that would not have suited him at all. But yeah, I think if it helps to plan, if it helps to come up with, certain attributes that you think your character wants to have, that's helpful going into a book. I think, I focus less on personality and more so little character quirks. Again, and, those things become more and more obvious to me as I'm writing the book. But, something as simple as, Luli is a merchant. How does she spend her time when she's waiting for people to approach her stall? And, I'm thinking to myself, oh, she's probably like fidgeting with a piece of gold. Is she, what is she doing? Is she a restless person? Is she, and so like the questions just kind of keep arising from that. And so allowing yourself to just kind of feel things out all the way through, I think is the best way to make a character feel authentic. Like if it feels like they're not fitting into a certain trope or a certain attribute, then don't force it.
Right.
I think, yeah. And sometimes that's not apparent until you finish a draft. I did not know most of what I know about my characters until I finished the first draft of The Stardust Thief and was able to go back, reread and think to myself, oh, okay, this is what I was going for, but this is where it ended up. And then in edits, I could go back and sort of comb through and make sure that it was all consistent.
Yeah. How long would you say it takes for you to write a draft of a book? And you're kind of like new into the publishing world as far as your manuscripts that you've written being published, but how much time do you set aside both in a day and in a year for you to kind of put structure to that manuscript?
It's, it's hard for me to say just because I have only, am wrapping up my second book now. But, one thing that has become more and more apparent to me is that I need more time to write. In the case of the second book, I actually ran into a lot of upheavals in my life that made it difficult for me to write on a specific schedule, which is unfortunate, but life happens. And so that's why things have been a little slower for me to write the sequel than I would have liked. But I would say for my first draft, for the Stardust Thief, it probably took me about 6-7 months to write the first draft because it was very long. I think the Ashfire King, it probably took me about the same amount of time, actually. The thing about the Ashfire King, I think it took me slightly less time, but because I was rushing through it a lot more, it was a lot rougher around the edges by the time I got to the end of it. And I think I didn't even really have an ending. And I said, but this is good enough for now. This is my filler ending. And it wasn't really until I'd started the editing process that I realized, oh, okay, no, I didn't realize that this is where the story was going in the first draft. Here's what I'm going to start building in the second draft. So for me, for the amount of words that I write rather quickly, but the problem is that I need to write a lot of words to figure out the book. So yeah, for the Stardust Thief, I think, like I said, it took about 6-7 months or something for the first draft. And then I spent years editing that draft and rewriting. As they say, writing is rewriting is rewriting is rewriting. I think another assumption that people have is, and some writers work this way, and I'm, extremely in awe of them. They write their first draft and then their second draft, everything is pretty stable. They have the plot, they have the characters. My drafts change so much in my process, which is actually why I'm really hesitant to share things early on when I'm writing. Because I will cut characters, I will cut plot threads, and I will do that across many different drafts. I think because I write so many words, I have to slowly but surely peel things away as I get further and further into my work. So yeah, I think for the first draft alone, probably about half a year, but then everything that comes after that, it kind of depends on the project.
Right.
That feels like how I would write if I were to ever tackle trying to write a book. I just know me, and I'm like, if I just get it all out of here onto the page, I'll sort through it and put the puzzle pieces where they need to go, right? So how you're describing it, I'm like, that would be me if that ever occurred. But so that makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so our Lunicorn, her name's Janet E. She asked the question, I'd always want to know when we talk to authors what their favorite snacks and drinks are while they write, their writing ritual, if you have a certain setting or time of day, those kinds of things. Just gives us a little bit of a peek behind the curtain.
Yeah. So I am a latte person, iced latte all the way. So usually when I sit down to write, and, this isn't the case because I kind of write when I have the ability to. I, have a 9-to-5 job. So for me, I have to write after work. But, if I'm, usually I'll write during my lunch breaks. So during my lunch break, I will have an iced latte. Usually if I'm out and about, so on a weekend, I like to do write outs with friends. Love to go to a cafe and get some kind of dessert. So I'm definitely a latte and dessert person. And then all year round, my specific thing is that I only like iced lattes. So, I am that not hot. Unfortunately, I wish I was more of a hot drink person. So I am that person who in winter is walking back home to write my book and, have my gloves on and this iced latte in my hands. And everyone's like, what are you doing? Why did you think this was a good idea? But yeah, there's just something about that, carving out that space, having those snacks in particular, that's really helpful. I mean, coffee is always good. Coffee definitely wakes me up and puts me more into a mindset where I can write.
I'm all, yeah. You guys can't see, but I've got mine right here. Yeah. I'm always like, yes, please, coffee, latte, all the things.
And I drink caffeine and I'm buzzed for 4 days.
You're so sensitive.
I have such a delicate constitution.
So delicate.
I can't, I wish, I drink a chai and it's Yeah, 8 days later, I wake, like finally fall asleep.
Yeah.
I know it. I love finding out about like the rituals of authors. I also love finding out about kind of their origin story. As you mentioned, the books your father read to you. I am curious to know, another one of our Lunicorns asked this question, and it's always one of the top questions we ask. And Brian K asked it, what literary world would you spend a day in? And I think I'm going to add on to that. So what world would you spend a day in? Fictional world. And then also what fictional character would you want to spend a day with or to just meet?
Oh, that's such a tough question.
I know. I love it.
Every time I get that question, I like every single answer that I have in my head immediately disappears. In terms of world, so the first thing that pops to mind, because again, there's so many different worlds that I want to visit. But the first thing that pops to mind, because I am also a gamer, there is a game version coming out of the Hobbits from Lord of the Rings, like of the Shire. And it looks really cute. It looks really sweet. So like that, I mean, maybe not, like definitely other parts of the world. I don't want to be involved in the grand epic war that is happening. But, but in terms of like, the coziness, that always feels very, very warming. So, again, I can, when not asked this question, I can think of about 100 different answers. But this is the first one that comes to mind because I was thinking about this game.
The Shire often comes to mind for me too. Every time we ask that question, I have like a few things that pop into my head, and the Shire is always one of them because it just feels like it feels like such a bookshop of a place.
I'm like, it's like catnip for readers.
Yes,
it really is. It's so cozy
delicious
and quaint and stunning, and it seems safe and just
So
all the things.
Which,
So
although now that you've brought up a library or brought up like a bookshop, it does make me think of The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern.
Yes.
That book takes place in like a subterranean library.
Oh, no, we know. Yeah.
I would love to visit that library. So that is another one that has just come to mind. But I feel this way about many of Erin Morgenstern's settings. They just have that sort of like magic to them.
Yeah.
Like visceral. It's like such a visceral kind of like immersive experience where everything is like textured and smells and like it's like a five senses kind of book. And that's how I felt about The Night Circus too. Both of them. I was like, oh, I can taste this book. Yes, most definitely. It's
what
magical.
was the follow-up question?
Oh, the character.
Oh, the character.
What character would you want to? It can be, and so Miriam B didn't even realize she asked this question, but it was just out of my curiosity. I want to know what fictional character, either that you've written or you've read, that you would want to spend the day with.
Well, of my own cast, the only character that I would feel safe spending the day with is probably Mazen. I feel like every other character would be holding a grudge against me for the things that I have done to them. Or,
they might not know who you are. Let's just say they don't know who you are.
If they didn't know, even if they didn't know who I was, though, I feel like Luli would con me out of my money. I would somehow insult Aisha. I would look at her the wrong way or something. And as much as I love Qadir, who is Luli's bodyguard, he is always doing what's best for Luli. And so if I got on Luli's bad side, it would kind of be an automatic no. Mazen is, because we both have that love for storytelling, because he's such an adventurer at heart, and so soft-hearted, I think he would be very easy to talk to. So if I got to spend a day with any of my characters from this trilogy in particular, it would probably be him. There's also a character in book 2, who is, kind of like the sunshine of a Sunshine and Grump dynamic. She's the kind of character who will threaten violence with like a very sunny smile.
Perfect.
She's been such a fun character to write. But I think she would also be the kind of character, like I would be so fascinated to hear her stories. Maybe a little afraid of her, but great conversations, I'm sure. In terms of other characters, I don't know if this is wise, but Gideon and Gideon the Ninth, I
love Gideon.
I love her voice so much, and I just think she'd be such a riot.
Most definitely.
Yeah,
Gideon,
so
that's one of my very favorite sci-fis of all time. I just thought it was, I was like gothic necromancy in space. It was so epic. It's a little bit of a polarizing book. When I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, everyone's going to love this. And I found it interesting. People got lost in it a bit, but I just thought Gideon was so witty. She was like just so clever, and all the delivery was very dry. And one of my favorite, Tamsin Muir, who wrote those, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, one of the fun things about those books, because I don't know if you've read the second and third books. The second book is, I most of the time don't know what is happening in the second book until we get to the end of the book.
Yes.
And then everything kind of clicks together, and it's like, oh my God, like galaxy brain moment.
Yes.
But one of the cool things I think about that series in general is, first of all, in book one, Gideon doesn't really know what's happening either. She's just kind of vibing.
Right.
And I think that makes her such an interesting character is, you have all these conspiracies unraveling. But she's just kind of going with the flow, making her little witty comments. And that in itself is kind of like an anchor in the book. So even amidst all this mystery, you have this character who is kind of this consistent, dry comedian.
Yes.
So I adore her as a character. I also, I'm forgetting their names off the top of my head. There's this really, cool relationship, platonic relationship between two of the other main characters who are in that mansion. And the dynamic that these two have in particular is so much fun. And so every once in a while, like when I'm reading this book, I think like, how cool would it be to like talk to these characters? So that cast in general, I think is very beloved.
It's just such a massive cast.
It's a larger cast.
Yeah.
So I literally had to have like a diagram. I'm like, okay, that one goes with that one. They're from there. But yeah, very clever. And also, I think the thing I loved about that series is you get the backstory in book 3 of like how everyone got to where they are. And you're like, oh my gosh, this started on Earth. Right. And so you're like, it's so hard to know that. So, but yeah, it's interesting. It kind of feels so galactic in the beginning, and then it brings it right back home in book 3. And I'm assuming there's going to be at least one more book, but I haven't seen anything on it recently. So
I think it's one more book.
4. Yeah. I wonder who it's going to be. Right.
I know, that's an excellent question.
Cause you've got, Gideon, and then the second one, and then Nona. What's the second one?
Harrow is second.
Harrow the ninth and Nona the ninth. So good. They're so good. I mean, but like I said, you got to be like into it, right? And I just understood Gideon immediately and was like, I love her so much.
So glad you guys can bond on this, because I think I was the one that got lost in it a little after the first book. I'm all, what the heck just happened?
I know.
I just re-explain it to me like I'm 5. And but I appreciated the writing, of course. Like it was great. I'm over here thinking like, oh, it'd be so fun if you could introduce different characters, like a character from your story to a different character from another story. Because Mazen, the whole time I'm like, he should meet Laszlo.
Oh,
from Strange to
I've gotten that comment before from readers.
I was just like, they'd be so cute.
I know that actually, Weep would be one of the places that I would want to visit.
Right.
I think Weep would be like remarkable. Both the Weep of Laszlo's dreams, as it's like has sunshine, and the Weep that just has that one spot where there's, sun. And just and the Great Library of Zosma.
Yeah.
Would be incredible. I know Lainey has a way of also being quite visceral in her writing. And like one of my all-time favorites. I think probably just always sentimental.
there's something very dreamy about her writing. It always feels like it feels like true escapism. It feels like you're in a totally different world.
Yes, but there's such stakes too, right? So that's really beautiful. A skill that she has is to increase the stakes while still feeling escapist.
Yes.
And really beautiful.
I always describe it as poetic, which it is, but I think that you just saying dreamy, I was like, yes, it literally feels like I woke up from a dream almost after finishing one of her stories. So, we always talk. We love Lainey. We talk about her a lot. Like
she
writing.
kind of gave us our start at LitJoy. She trusted us. So, speaking of authors, books, other authors, right now, what is on your TBR list?
On my TBR list, I actually have an ARC. So The Dividing Sky by Jill 2 is a YA sci-fi that's coming out. This one is out in October 2024. So I recently got a copy of the ARC. In general, I'm a little, I don't want to say wary of sci-fi. I'm a little wary of hard sci-fi. Because if it's a little, if you have to go into paragraphs and paragraphs of explanation, then you've lost me. Because I'm more of a character reader than I am, a setting reader, I'd say in general. If I don't care about the characters, then, I don't really want to sit through very long setting descriptions. But I'm very excited about The Dividing Sky. I've heard really great things about it. I had actually been following the author, I think before she got published, potentially before she got agented, but I can't remember. So it's been a joy to see her journey. And I'm very excited to be reading this. And then I have a sequel, This Ends in Embers by Camilla Cole, which the ARC for that book is not out, but Camilla is one of my friends.
Nice.
So I am very excited to be seeing, the end of her duology, to see where it ends. So yeah, those are two of the upcoming books for me.
And just in case anyone listening is unsure what an ARC is, it's an ARC or an advanced reader's copy. So I'm like, how lucky you get that in advance to read. It's a perk, right?
It's one of the author perks.
Yeah. Okay, just wrapping up with a final question or two here. Always like to ask, what are you working on right now? And where can readers find you? Online.
Yeah. So online, I am Chelsea Abdullah. So CHELS ABDULLAH on Instagram. I'm also technically on Threads and X, but am not there very frequently. So if you want to follow me there, maybe I'll post something. But I'm most active on Instagram. I also have a Substack newsletter, which is, you can find on my Instagram as well. The links are there. And I have a website, chelseaabdullah.com. And then, what was the other question you asked?
Just what you're working on right now.
What I'm working on right now. So I'm wrapping up things on my sequel, finally. Very, very excited to be at this point in the process. And like I said, really hoping to have release date information soon. And, from there, I'll be working on my third book. But I also have a couple of projects that I've kind of been taking a stab at in between, just to take a little break from the book. One is a potential YA project that I'm really excited about, but is still in the very early stages. I have something that is cozy / comedic fantasy that I've been, in my head comping to The Princess Bride. So it has kind of those, wacky adventure, not taking itself too seriously vibes. And then, another adult project, which has been with me for a very long time, like 10 plus years, that, I've poured a lot of myself into. Tentatively right now it's called Chrono Keeper. But it is I think back then it was called Twitter. On Twitter, I had called it like a clock punk fantasy. So it's a lot of clock technology, a lot of time magic.
Cool.
But it takes place in a world that's a little bit, it's not quite epic. It's more modern fantasy. Takes place in a single city, a single very magical city, but sort of has those vibes. So very different than the Sandsea Trilogy, but I think it will be a nice transfer over into something different.
Beautiful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Emma. That sounds cool.
Yes.
Reminds me of like Loki a little bit when we
For
that,
sure.
like, series.
Yes.
I'm like, I love it. I dig it.
Amazing.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Chelsea, for coming on and taking this time to, answer our questions and come on the podcast. This has been great. This is really fun. And it flew by like that fast.
Yes. Thank you so much. I mean, I feel like we got such a beautiful window into your writing process. And I feel like our readers are going to love to hear more about it because they have loved your book and loved your collection with us. And so we're just really thankful.
Oh, well, thank you both. And I have been, so thrilled to be sharing LaJoy's collection of the Stardust Thief merchandise as well. I don't have it on the desk with me right now, but that two-faced coin that was produced is like my favorite thing. I'm like always turning it around in my fingers when I'm drafting. So,
oh, that's amazing.
I love that.
That's so cool. Thank you, reader, for listening. Please remember to rate and review us.
And like a good book, recommend us to your friends.